Dark academia, defined as a literary and social media aesthetic and subculture concerned with higher education, writing, poetry, the arts, and classic Greek and Gothic architecture. I decided to begin this video with a definition because it felt like a very academic thing to do, but I'm gonna assume that anyone who clicked on this video already knows what dark academia is, and if you don't, I'm a little bit wondering what rock you've been hiding under over the last couple years. So in this week's video, I want to share with you some of my all-time favorite dark academia reads. I also want to dive in and read a couple well-known dark academia books that I haven't gotten around to just yet. I'm going to be attempting to read 5 books by the end of this video, but I'm also trying to film this video in under a week. So send me good vibes, fast reading vibes. Elizabeth of the Future dropping in here for just 1 second to talk to you about today's video sponsor, Book of the Month. Now I imagine if you spend just about any time in bookish spaces on the internet, then you will have already heard of Book of the Month, but if not, let me give you a quick introduction. Book of the Month is a super popular and fast-growing online book service for readers. Their mission is to promote new and emerging authors and to help readers discover books they love. Their team vets hundreds of books each and every month and gives their readers a choice of a curated list of new and early release titles so you can spend more time reading and less time researching. As a Canadian, I'm super excited to announce that Book of the Month has finally come to Canada. I know my fellow Canadian book lovers have felt the pain, seeing our American friends raving about Book of the Month and their new awesome picks, and just feeling left out in the cold up here in the north. But finally, we can participate because Book of the Month has arrived. Book of the Month is also risk-free. You can skip any month at any time and you will not be charged. Plus, they have the best price for new hardcover fiction. You can get your first book for just $9.99 Canadian with the code CANADA. And it comes with a little bookmark that says if you were a book, you'd be a classic, which is adorable. For my first month with Book of the Month, they let me pick 2 books, which I am super excited about. So I wanted to share both of them with you really quick. Let me open up the famous blue box. That's right. Blood Marked by Tracy Deonn. Now, I actually haven't read the first book in this series yet, but I've heard so many good things from so many people whose opinions I trust, and I just knew I was gonna love it, so I decided to pick up the second book in the series, and I'm very excited. The back says very mysteriously, will she become the legend or break it? This is a young adult fantasy series that has been taking the internet by storm, which has to do with a secret society descended of Arthur's knights, which I love. I'm such a fan of Arthurian legends and books that take inspiration from Arthurian legends. I'm all aboard this train. My second pick for this month was White Horse by Erica T. Worth, and this is one that I hadn't heard about before, but when I read the description, I immediately knew I had to pick it. It sounded so intriguing. This is a horror novel, and it has to do with ghosts, the paranormal, a mysterious entity, also complicated family dynamics, complicated relationships. It sounds really, really fantastic, and I'm super excited about it. Head to bookofthemonth.com to see their other picks, and make sure to use code CANADA to get your first book for $9.99 Canadian. Thank you so much to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. I am so excited to hop into these, although I have to finish the books for this video first. Priorities. I can't get carried away. So first of all, I want to go through my recommendations real quick. So the first one I definitely have to mention is The Atlas 6 by Olive Blake. This is fantasy, so there is magic, but it is 100% dark academia vibes. It is a school setting, lots of darker themes, morally gray characters, and ethical quandaries, all those things that we love to see in dark academia. Even though this book has been hyped to death on the internet, I think it's still worth a read. Another great option is one that I just finished, In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This book has 2 intertwining timelines, both of which take place on a university campus. Again, we have ethically gray characters, we have a mysterious murder, we have secrets and lies, totally dark academia. These next 2, I would say, are on the cusp of dark academia, The Starless Sea and The Night Circus. One thing I'll say about these is that they tend to be very polarizing. You're either gonna love them or hate them. I adore them, but if you're not into the idea of a book that has very little plot, but a whole lot of vibes, you're probably not gonna enjoy these 2. But if you're okay with just sort of existing in a world, soaking in the aesthetic, meeting some interesting characters, wandering around, you'll enjoy these. My next recommendation is Dark Academia to the letter, to the nines. It is If We Were Villains by ML Rio. If you are into hanging out with a very small class of actors enrolled in a competitive acting program with a focus on Shakespeare with a little sprinkling of murder, this is your book. As a theater school graduate and a lover of Shakespeare, I could relate too hard to too much of this book. I loved it. It has all of the dark academia vibes. If you haven't read it and you're a fan of dark academia, truly what are you doing? My next recommendation is The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. The whole plot surrounds a mysterious author and a one-of-a-kind book with mystery and murder and arson and destruction, all taking place in 1940s Barcelona. This book just has every single one of the vibes. Next, I want to mention Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Not 100% technically dark academia, I suppose, because again, not taking place at a university, but our protagonist, Dr. Frankenstein, is a scientist, and the whole book is centered around a scientific experiment gone wrong. Or not gone wrong, depending on your perspective, I suppose. Speaking of classics that shine a light on men doing ill-advised experiments, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. You have that gothic literature influence, you have the darkness, the moral quandaries, the ethical dilemmas, violence and mystery, and then also that scientific element of the whole experimentation thing. One more classic recommendation for dark academia, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, one of my favorite classics. Really interesting, intelligent characters, a mysterious, dark, and morally questionable central character, murder and mystery. Oscar Wilde is a genius, so if you haven't read any of his work, and even if you have, but you haven't read this one yet, please do. In this same vein, pun intended, I would recommend Dracula by Bram Stoker. Again, it totally has those gothic, dark vibes, and two of the main characters are doctors or scientists, so it still has that academic leaning, and many of the conversations between those two characters specifically do feel very academic in nature. I just feel like it's a perfect read for spooky season, of course, but also dark academia season. A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee is another great option. This is YA, takes place at a college. Again, all of the vibes, academic setting, morally great characters, darkness, mystery, secrets. All of the main pillars of dark academia are in this book. Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This is another one that's quite polarizing. People seem to love it or hate it. I loved it. It is very weird, and you don't necessarily always know what's happening, but that's part of the fun. Again, takes place in a school setting, very prestigious private school that's difficult to get into, and we have a bit of a melancholic main character, something mysterious going on at the school that she's trying to parse. It's very hazy and strange and great. Bunny by Mona Awad, another one that is very polarizing. Again, very strange. Never really know what's real and what's not. That's something I love in a book when it's done well, and I believe it was very, very well done in Bunny. Plain Bad Heroines by Emily Danforth. This was not my favorite book of all time. I did want to mention it because it does really have dark academia vibes. It does have that academic setting, the darkness and the mystery and the characters that are a little hard to root for. Okay, my last recommendation, because I want to get to the main portion of this video, which is me reading some awesome dark academia books. My last recommendation is going to shock no one because I recommend this book at every opportunity, and that is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. This book, again, not technically within an academic setting, but this has all of the elements of a great dark academia read. It's mysterious, it's horrifying, it has such complex, unreliable, unlikable characters, and there are really three narratives intertwined in this book, and one of them is an old man who has dedicated a large portion of his life to analyzing a documentary in a rigorously academic way with 5 million footnotes and references and asides into really interesting but seemingly unrelated areas of study. If this sounds so boring to you, then don't read this book. But if that sounds great to you, like it does to me, you should pick it up. Maybe not a traditional pick for dark academia, but again, I will find literally any opportunity to recommend this book. So go read it. Okay, so those are all my recommendations. Go forth and read them if you haven't yet. If you have, let me know what you thought in the comments down below, because I love to hear your thoughts on the books that I've read so we can nerd out about them together. It's the best part about talking about books on the internet. But now I want to focus on the 5 books that I'm hoping to read for this video. The first one is widely known as the originator of dark academia, and that is The Secret History by Donna Tart. I have not read this book yet. It's honestly a little mind-blowing. This is constantly at the top of the list anytime anyone is giving dark academia recommendations, and I have heard so many good things. I have loved so many books that are said to be inspired by or similar to this one right here. I'm finally getting to it this week. I am reading The Secret History, and I'm pretty excited. Next is a recent release that has everybody buzzing, and that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. But the internet has been abuzz about this book since people started getting early access copies, and I've heard that I would love it from everyone I know who has read it. It might take me a little while, but I'm committed to it. So we just talked about the most recent release out of these 5. So here's the oldest of the 5, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. This one's pretty widely categorized under dark academia, and it's been on my shelf for such a long time, this beautiful edition. Oh my god. I've been meaning to get around to this for so long, so now is my opportunity. And the 2 final books I'm hoping to read for this challenge are The Book Eaters and Vita Nostra. Both of these have been on my radar for a while. The Book Eaters is a newer release, but I've been hearing rumblings about it for quite a while, and Vita Nostra has been on my list for what feels like forever. I feel like it's a slightly lesser known book, but is apparently squarely in the dark academia genre, and according to quite a few people whose opinions I trust, it's quite fantastic. I've heard mixed things about The Book Eaters, which makes me sad because I was super excited about it, so hopefully I will be one of those who love it instead of one of those who hate it, but we shall see. So these are the 5 books I'm reading for this challenge, and I find it mildly hilarious that they all are black covers with gold writing. Clearly the marketing teams at publishers know what dark academia readers want. So hopefully I'll be able to finish all 5. We shall see. And of course, just like in all of my reading vlog style videos, I'll be popping in as I finish the books to give my thoughts and reviews. And then at the end, I'll do a little wrap up of all 5. So because I've already started Babel, this is going to be the first one I dive into. And then I think once I've really established myself in Babel, I'll also start reading The Secret History, and then we'll go from there. I was going to say Chewy is excited for this challenge because he's in here with me, but honestly, Chewy is a scaredy cat and he would not read dark academia even if he could read. Isn't that right? Okay, so I finished Babel last night, and please don't hate me. I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. Okay, I didn't hate it. I can hear hundreds of people starting to type angry comments about how it's the best book they've ever read and they hate me now. This book has been so hyped on the internet. It's ridiculous. Like, everyone is saying it's a masterpiece. Everyone's saying it's the best book they've read ever, or this year at the very least. People saying it's their new favorite. People saying that R.F. Kuang is a genius. To be fair, R.F. Kuang seems to be a super intelligent person. I'm not trying to diminish their intelligence, but my expectations were raised to such an extent. There are very few books that, for me, having gotten that level of hype, would have actually matched it, and I would have not felt disappointed. Unfortunately, this one just had too many problems for me personally. I was just kind of disappointed, which really sucks. So first I want to start with the positives. I enjoyed how the story was written. I thought the plotting and the pacing were pretty good. There were maybe some little nitpicks here and there for me. I found the ending a little quick and the beginning was quite slow, for example, or there were some plot twists that were maybe a little too clearly telegraphed too early on so that they were quite predictable as we got to them. But overall, I didn't really have any issues with the plot or with the pacing in general. Magic system-wise, loved it. The magic system in this book is brilliant. It's fascinating. So much research clearly went into it. It's such a great idea, and the way that it works in the story, the way it's utilized in the story, was really well done, and I appreciated that tremendously. I also loved the way that this story explored the issue of colonialism through a linguistic lens. Fascinating on so many levels, and R.F. Kuang has so much knowledge in terms of linguistics and really uses that knowledge to the fullest. And she's clearly spent a lot of time thinking about the ways that language and translation tie into colonialism. It's just a whole area of this issue that I haven't thought about before. It is really deeply thought-provoking and horrifying, like lots of things in this book. Such an interesting lens through which to look at colonialism and the experiences of the characters. So well done. Now for the negatives. The characters. Listen, I am so biased because I am a character-driven reader through and through. If I don't find the characters interesting, I don't have to like them, but I have to feel like they could exist. I have to find them interesting. I have to understand their motivations to a certain extent for me to really enjoy a book. And for me, the characters in this book just were not well developed. Not even our protagonist. Robin is pretty one-dimensional for a character that we spend a 500+ page book with. He barely changes through the majority of the book despite aging quite significantly. And when he does change, the change is so abrupt, so sudden and severe that it doesn't feel realistic at all. I had similar issues with all of the characters. Remy, I really enjoyed as a character, but he did feel a little bit like a cardboard cutout used as a mouthpiece for the author. It often felt like his monologues were just the author writing what she wanted to say about a certain idea. He didn't feel like a fully fleshed out person, just like none of the characters did. Victoire was not nearly as incorporated as I would have wanted her to be, especially considering her role later in the book. I think she needed to be more deeply developed much earlier on. And the same for Letty, who of the four main characters really was the most cartoonish. They just don't have a presence, really. So for me, that was probably the biggest drawback of this book. The characters didn't feel real, and it made it really difficult for me to fully immerse myself in the story and engage with it on more of an emotional level. I found the book intellectually stimulating. The ideas were so interesting and so well presented. Like I said, the lens through which we're viewing these ideas is so fascinating, but it just didn't hit home as a human story for me. I also struggled with the author's lack of subtlety. I don't think you necessarily always have to be subtle in terms of your themes, but my problem was more so that ideas were expressed and then reiterated again by another character, and then there was a footnote where the author expressly said what you were supposed to feel or think about this event. 2 chapters later, it would be brought up again, and you'd go through that sort of domino effect of constant repetition of these ideas, and it sort of felt like being hit over the head with everything in a way that felt a little patronizing, as if R.F. Kuang didn't trust her readers enough to believe that they would be able to pick up what she was putting down the first time. And this didn't impact my impression of her writing in general, because like I said, I enjoyed the writing. I enjoyed the words that were used. I enjoyed the structure of the sentences. I liked how paragraphs flowed into each other. I even enjoyed the footnotes when they weren't too repetitive in terms of what was in the main text, but this is just something that I think was more so tied into the thematic content of the book. I just think she was underestimating her readers and their ability to make those connections on their own. That's what I'll say about that. So I've gone back and forth on this since I finished the book yesterday because I feel really on the fence with my rating, but as of right now, in this exact moment, I'm sitting at about a 3 out of 5. So that's what I'm going to give you right now. 3 silver bars out of 5 for Babel. And I've also been reading The Secret History this whole time. I am just past halfway through, I think, page 302, and I've been enjoying it so far. Hey, I'm back. I finished the next 2 books for this video's challenge, The Secret History and The Book Eaters. Okay, starting with The Secret History, because this is the one that I read second for this challenge. I was really worried about this book, to be honest. Similarly to Babel, this book has been hyped so much, and because it's been around for several more decades, it's been hyped for even longer than Babel. I don't do too well when books have been really, really hyped and I read them and they don't live up to the hype. I was really worried that would happen with this book, and I'm very happy to report that it did not. The Secret History lived up to the hype for me, and I'm so happy about it. So let me talk about this for a second. The Secret History follows our protagonist, Richard, who was just transferred into this elite New England college from California, where he grew up, where he was beginning to study for a medical degree, but everything fell apart, and he's decided that he wants to focus on the classics, specifically ancient Greek. So he finds his way at this tiny little elite college in a very different environment than he's used to, and he joins this very small, very strange ancient Greek cohort of students who are all entranced by their charismatic professor, and each of the students of his group is equally obsessed with the classics, with ancient languages, but also blasé and self-consciously clever, and most of them disgustingly wealthy. And Richard, our middle-class California boy, feels completely out of his element and just marinates in his own ennui and disdain for everything and everyone around him for all, how long is this book? 550 odd pages. And this unlikely group of friends and classmates very quickly unravels into this spreading darkness of obsession and envy, with a tendency toward the brutal and dramatic, and of course, as one would expect, murder. For me anyway, as I mentioned earlier in this video, I am a very character-driven reader, and the characters in this book were really its highlight for me. And not because they're likable characters or even good people, because they're not, but because they're interesting. They're layered, they're dynamic, they are struggling with their own demons. Each and every one of the central cohort are struggling with their own sort of species of demon, and their interactions are very interesting. And the way that they organize themselves into this hierarchy and really bury themselves into this strange academic world of ancient Greek and luxury. I was just completely drawn in, and I couldn't help but care about each of these characters, even though I hated them all. And I did hate them all, basically for the entire book, but I still cared about them somehow. And it's a very fine balance that I think many authors struggle to find. I thought the writing was beautiful. It was very lyrical. There were so many descriptions that just made me take a step back for a second, and I wanted to reread a passage, and I would tab it just to remember those combinations of words later, because they just rolled off the tongue and sort of coagulated in my brain in this beautiful image. I also loved how the story seemed to emulate the structure of a tragic play. The slow unraveling of all of the characters, and you as the reader having this certainty that nothing is going to turn out well for any of them, and you just see their potential disappearing. You see them self-destructing and making awful choices, and all you can do is kind of revel in the tragedy and in the destruction and observe the mess of wasted lives at your feet as everything crumbles, because it just feels inevitable. The tragedy was always going to come. It's simply the result of these characters' fatal flaws. One of the biggest criticisms that I've seen so far for The Secret History is that it is pretentious, and it is. If you have an issue with pretentious literature, I mean, in the first place, dark academia might not be your genre, might not be your cup of tea, because I feel like pretension is just part of the genre, it's part of the trope. But this is a very pretentious novel. The characters are incredibly pretentious, and you will roll your eyes at them constantly. But it kind of feels like the author is in on it with you, like you're both rolling your eyes at just how ridiculously pretentious these children are and how mature and adult they feel, even though they're like 20 years old. You know, it's just campy, and I kind of loved it. I was just reveling in the ridiculousness of it all. So for me, The Secret History totally lived up to the hype. I had a grand time reading it, to be honest. And I give it 5 ancient Greek studying, disgustingly wealthy, and deeply pretentious college students out of 5. Also, apropos of nothing, I found out that The Secret History was published about a month after I was born in 1992. And I think that's pretty cool. So that's just a fun fact for you. Just hold on to that for the next party you're at when you need some small talk. You can just share that a YouTuber you watch was born a month before The Secret History was published, because, you know, that's a fact anyone needs to know. I thought it was exciting. also finished The Book Eaters over the weekend, and this book I was really worried about because I had heard so many good things. I was really, really excited to read this one, but slowly after this book was released and more people who hadn't had ARCs started reading it and reviewing it, I started hearing more less than raving reviews from people who either were disappointed in it, felt it was overhyped, or felt it was sort of mismarketed, and people who just generally didn't enjoy it. It wasn't for them. But I'm happy to report that I really enjoyed this book. I didn't have the problems with it that I had been hearing other people had had. I had a great time. And I will say at the beginning, I was nervous. It took me a while to get into it. The first several chapters, I wasn't quite sure how I felt about the writing style. There was something about the tone that wasn't quite connecting for me. But after those first couple chapters, I acclimatized to the vibe of the story and completely fell into this headfirst. I was ripping through it at a ridiculous pace, just inhaling it, and finished it relatively quickly and just felt all the feels. So let me talk to you about The Book Eaters. This book is essentially a modern take on not only fairy tales, but on the myth of the vampire, a new version of a vampire, and I really liked the way it was done. This book explores the experiences of womanhood and motherhood within a patriarchal system with elements of fantasy and horror. I loved the protagonist of this story, Devon. She is not your typical princess. She is like 6 feet tall, and I love the tall woman representation in fantasy. I feel like you don't often come across a protagonist in a fantasy novel who is a woman who is tall enough that people are commenting on it, and as someone who is almost 6 feet tall and people comment on it ad nauseum because apparently I'm not aware that I am taller than everyone I meet. I really appreciated the tongue-in-cheek reactions that Devon had to literally everyone commenting on her height all of the time, because I feel you. Relatable. But anyways, Devon is awesome. She loves wearing all black and leather. She wears a lot of men's clothes and big boots. She's a badass. She's not your typical girly, ultra feminine princess in a fairy tale. And I really loved how this story jumped between the two timelines of the modern day and then Devon's earlier life, from childhood through to her early adulthood and becoming a mother, because you can really follow the transformation of the character from a young girl whose life is so predetermined by those around her and so narrow based on the few fairy tales that she has been allowed to consume, and the ways in which the fairy tales and the stories that she is allowed to become acquainted with really mold her mind and her worldview in a way that traps her, really, because she can't imagine any other life than the one she's living. And you get to follow her as she becomes a mother, and that fierceness, that fight really explodes in her. The little kernel that was there when she was a child that made her rebellious and gave her that sharp tongue that everyone always commented on really explodes when she becomes a mother, and that fierce protective side comes out. And I just love that. I love the commentary on how the types of stories that we choose to introduce to our children, especially to our young girls, how those stories really shape the way that they view the world and their expectations of their place in it, of what their future could look like. The idea that only feeding girls stories where the happy ending is a marriage might lead them to feel like their purpose in life, their ultimate goal, is to become a wife, to ride off into the sunset, and to not necessarily have other goals and futures planned for themselves. And that all of these things can really harden our perspectives in a way that can be difficult to undo in adulthood. And I think that's true not only of the stories that we give to our children, but also the worldviews that we share with them, the perspectives that we allow them to absorb as a child. I just think that's a fascinating idea, and I really enjoyed the way that that was incorporated in this story through the concept of the book eaters. I also loved how this book tackled motherhood, and it was really interesting for me because I am not necessarily someone who reads a lot of stories that center the experiences of mothers. I'm not a mother. I don't know if I'll ever be a mother, but I really loved Devon, and I really loved the way that she experienced her motherhood, and the fact that it wasn't portrayed as this perfect, all good all the time experience, that there was an acknowledgement of the pain that comes with parenthood, the sacrifice, the difficulty, the horror, and also the fact that love itself, as much as it is sort of a driving force for our species, is not always a good thing, is not the ultimate good. Love can also be destructive. Love can lead us to do evil things. And I found it really fascinating the way that this book explored that concept through Devon's motherhood and her love of her children. And it reminded me a lot, actually, of Essen from the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which is one of my favorite fantasy trilogies of all time. And Essen is one of my favorite fantasy protagonists of all time. She is also a fierce mother, and her love is a driving force for both good and ill through those books. And Devon really reminded me of her in the best way. I feel like there's even more to unpack in this story than I got on my first read, partially because, like I said, I devoured it. So I think this is going to be one that I'm going to have to go back through and read a little bit slower, savor it a little more, let it marinate on the tongue, really separate all those flavors instead of inhaling it in a single evening, because there's just a lot of layers in here, and I'm excited to delve into all of those. So for me, The Book Eaters was a great experience to read. I really enjoyed it. I am glad that I went ahead and read it anyway, despite the bad reviews I started to hear, because for me, this was fantastic. So I give The Book Eaters 5 Game Boys out of 5. You'll only get that reference once you read the book. So with that, I'm more than halfway through this challenge. I just have 2 more books to read, and I've actually already started both of them because I got a little carried away. So I'm gonna go off and finish Vita Nostra and Wuthering Heights, possibly by tomorrow, and then I'll be back to give you my final thoughts, and we'll wrap up this whole video. I'm back for the final update of this video. I finished Vita Nostra and Wuthering Heights, and I'm excited to share my thoughts and wrap this video up for you. So Vita Nostra, this book started off a little bit slow for my taste. I would say basically the entire first part, I was a little checked out. I wasn't really connecting to our protagonist. I wasn't necessarily feeling the direction it seemed like the story was going. It wasn't really doing anything for me. But then part 2 happened, and from then on, I was completely hooked. This book is wild. It's mind-bending and horrifying and also fascinating all at once. I feel like so many of the concepts in this book went right over my head. I haven't been made to feel so unintelligent reading a book for a long time. I just felt so stupid reading this, having to go back and reread sentences or whole paragraphs trying to figure out what in the actual heck was happening and why I was not getting it. I feel like this is a book that I'm gonna have to reread multiple times and probably do some extra research to fully understand. But what I did get from it was freaking cool. I'm a fan. It's super weird. It's quite dark. It's quite strange. I can imagine that this book would not be for everyone, but it was definitely for me. Like I said, once we got to part 2, I was completely hooked, and the rest of the book for me was super fast-paced, heart-pounding, just completely immersive. I read the last portion of the book so quickly. I did not want to put it down. I absolutely loved it, and I recommend it to anyone who likes a good, weird, incomprehensible, dark story in an academic setting. 5 mysterious gold coins out of 5. Okay, the final book of this video, and I'm trying to be fast now because I know this video is probably so long. I'm sorry. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Despite the fact that I was warned that this book was not a love story and that it was not what I would expect and that it was dark, I was not sufficiently warned. All the books that I read for this video are dark in their own way. All of them have unlikable characters to varying degrees. Some of them, like The Secret History, literally every single character is unlikable. So clearly that is not enough for me to dislike a book. The fact that it's dark and every character sucks. But oh my god, this book tried my patience. Listen, I finished this earlier today, and I have a feeling that I'm gonna need quite a bit of time to let myself ruminate on this one, to really let my thoughts properly percolate and come to something more coherent. I also have a feeling that I'm gonna have to reread it at some point, but here are my unfiltered immediate thoughts upon finishing it. Oh my god, I hate these characters. There are a few exceptions that are fine, you know, or characters who maybe have a couple traits that are irritating or at times can be awful, but are redeemable in the end. But some of these central characters that we spend a very long time focusing on are just horrific people. And I commend Emily Bronte for creating characters that are so vivid and feel so real that they incited a fiery pit of passionate hatred in my soul while reading. I think that is a feat, you know. I was intrigued by the story. I found myself compelled to continue reading, but I did not like these characters, and I hated every choice that they made. I feel like this is a story of two things, really. One is sort of doomed, tragic lovers who have no opportunity to find happiness, and just the tragedy that is having to live through the rest of your life with a broken heart, having been torn away from your true love. I don't want to give spoilers, but it didn't have to be this way, which makes it even more frustrating. But I think it's an interesting idea to explore, and a look at the ways that heartbreak can really twist someone into something horrific and monstrous. But for me, the romance was sort of secondary. I didn't care for it much, that central romance and those two central characters. Probably my least favorite part of this book. What intrigued me the most was the exploration of cycles of violence, of generational trauma, of child abuse, and the impact that that has on the child when they become an adult, and how they perpetrate that on others, how hatred and cruelty begets more hatred and cruelty. And there is a tiny kernel of hope in this book that it is possible to escape from that cycle and to choose a more peaceful and kinder path, but that it is an uphill battle and not everyone is able to escape that cycle of violence, of abuse, and that generational trauma that you can't just wish away. This was a very depressing book. I feel like I need a vacation now that I finished it. I have very mixed feelings because on the one hand, like I said, it really evoked such strong emotions in me, which to me is the indication of an effective work. I think the ideas it explored are interesting, and it was done in a very vivid way, but I didn't enjoy the process of reading this book pretty much for even one moment. I don't necessarily think that Wuthering Heights should classify as dark academia. It's certainly dark, but it doesn't really have that academic leaning to it that the other books that I read for this challenge do. I would say it's pretty perfect to read at the end of fall and beginning of winter, and it's perfect to read when you're in a really thoughtful, introspective, sort of morose state of mind, but not really dark academia, in my opinion. Of course, you may disagree. I'm sort of on the fence. I think where I am right now, again, very shortly after finishing this, and maybe my opinion will change with time or with a reread, but I think where I'm landing is 3 stars. So that's where I'm at. I feel a little bit like I got hit by a train. So there's that. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you've read Wuthering Heights, how did you feel about it? I understand why it's so polarizing, because even within myself, I feel very polarized about the experience of reading this. I'd also love to know your thoughts on any of the other books that I read in this video. If you've read them, what were your thoughts? Did you like them? Did you not? Do you agree with my thoughts on them? Leave those in the comments down below. I want to chat about books with you. I'd also love to know if you have more dark academia recommendations that I didn't mention in this video. Leave them down below. If they're new to me, I'll probably pick them up because I'm definitely on a dark academia kick, and this video has not made me sick of it, not one bit. So that is it for my little foray into dark academia. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it all the way to the end, and I imagine this video is quite long, thank you for doing that. Leave some sort of book-related emoji or an emoji that feels representative of dark academia to you in the comments down below so I know you're a real one. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for sharing your thoughts in the comments. I can't wait to read them. Thanks again to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to go to bookofthemonth.com and use code Canada to get your first book for $9.99 Canadian. I really feel like Wuthering Heights did me in. I need a nap. Bye, friends.